Hello and welcome to the Predictable B2B Success podcast. I'm Vinay Koshy, and our guest today has a passion for the Femtech space. Now, if you're unfamiliar with space, this particular statistic may provide a bit of a perspective. The global Femtech market size accounted for $40.2 billion, that's US, in 2020, and was projected to grow at an average compound annual growth rate of 13.3% till 2025 to reach $75.1 billion US dollars. Now, despite increasing interest in recent years, the industry remains underestimated and has a high growth potential. However, this is an opportunity with its share of unique challenges. Now, to tell us more is our guest, Capcucine Cogne. Capcucine, you're a freelance writer and copywriter, but you also have this passion for the Femtech space. You're also something of a linguist. You speak 4 languages and hold a master's and bachelor's from the UK and China's leading universities. I'm curious, you have a bit of a side hustle, as you were just saying. Could you tell us a bit more about that?
Yes, of course. As you mentioned, I'm a content writer and copywriter and sometimes more, focusing on the femtech space, but also climate tech and ed tech. And then my side hustle is called Understand Your Cycle. And I co-founded it about a year ago now. Understand Your Cycle is everything we should have been taught in school about our menstrual cycles. So we have created a short, empowering guide about the menstrual cycle, and we are about to launch a platform where women are able to share their experiences about different women's health issues and their cycle, etc., all medically verified by a team of doctors.
Brilliant. That sounds like quite a project, but I'm curious, was there a particular event that got you started down this path and interest in the whole femtech space?
Yes, for sure. As with a lot of companies in femtech, I think personal struggles start and trigger us to launch companies. So personally, I had a lot of issues with my period growing up. And then when I ran my first marathon, I was fundraising for a period poverty startup. No, NGOs, sorry, not startup. And called Sanitary Aid Nigeria, an amazing charity. And it got me super interested in the problematics around periods. And slowly but steadily, I started educating myself. And as I started educating myself, I started writing more about the menstrual cycle. And then that led to writing about fertility, menopause, and a lot of other women's health issues that are so often not talked about.
I would imagine that in this journey, writing is obviously one of your key strengths, but if you were to pick, what would you say would be your personal area of strength?
My personal area of strength? Ooh, in general or?
Yeah, in general.
Okay. Oh, that's a hard one. So I used to work in business development, and I think a key strength of mine, both in business development and marketing, is understanding in quite a simple way and rapid way a brand or company's strategy. And so that is very helpful to me, because from that I can deliver on the different things that I need to deliver on.
And in that area of strength, what would you say is something that businesses don't know but should?
I'm going to go a bit classic because I am a copywriter and content writer, and words matter to me. But so often companies underestimate how important their branding is. And I'm not just saying website or your Instagram, but the newsletters people receive, or the LinkedIn of your CEO, all of that sort of contributes to your brand. And if you ask people, or if you're a listener listening to us right now, and you think of your favorite brand, why is it your favorite brand? Is it because they had a funny tagline that you saw and it caught your eye and then you started using the product? Is it because you read their newsletter religiously every single day and it's so consistent and it resonates with you. And so I think in order to build loyalty and traction, there's traction that starts with sort of short-term branding, but then loyalty continues with consistent messaging and branding. And I think that can really be underestimated quite easily.
Right. If people undervalue branding, and in particular the value of words and messaging, could you maybe provide an example or perhaps elaborate on the idea, especially when it comes, especially in relation to impacting revenue?
I think when you're starting a startup and when you're starting a business, especially, and I focus on startups, so this will be more on the early stage business or smaller business side, you're often thinking about the short term quite naturally because you're trying to survive and things are going super quickly. And so I think with regards to your question on revenue, sometimes businesses sacrifice the long-term revenue versus the short-term. And with content and copywriting, you can really see this with SEO, for example. So SEO is search engine optimization. Now, this can take years. It can take so long to create. It can also start tomorrow versus social media and reels. Social media and reels or like TikToks, etc., they give you immediate visibility versus creating blog content, which could take longer, will have a much more long-term return. And so I think that is an example I use to show the importance of words and your branding, because the blog doesn't only bring you search engine optimization, but it also brings you credibility for when people land on your page.
Certainly. And I guess the other concept or idea of branding that people think of are the visuals. And I wonder if you have seen a good balance being maintained between visuals or media and messaging. And if so, could you provide some examples of brands that you believe have successfully integrated both aspects?
Yeah, for sure. And I work a lot with visuals. I work a lot with graphic designers because I'm a firm believer that they need to work together. Otherwise, what's the point? We've been working a lot on this for Understand Your Cycle, so I'll shamelessly plug that in. And then I think Shopify does it really well. Spotify, sorry, not Shopify. Spotify does it super well. I was working on Shopify earlier, that's why. With the balance of words and visuals. What other company? I can picture the ads, but not necessarily the companies.
So with Spotify, you're thinking more of the ads that they use,
the ads,
or other particular pages?
Also the website, also their Instagram. I think they balance the two out really well, and they complement each other. Another company that I've been working with, which I think does it very well, is called Go My Code, which is one of the biggest ed techs in Africa, and they always balance the photo with some tagline. And I think the importance is also to combine the two. It can't be a photo about something completely different to the tagline. Yeah, I'll leave it at that because I'm bad at remembering names. But that's a great question.
That's quite all right. I'm just thinking back to earlier conversation where I think you mentioned that some people in your LinkedIn network, which started as a bit of a VC network, didn't quite necessarily resonate with the Femtech space. And perhaps that's an ongoing issue even today. What, in your opinion, is causing this disconnect? And how would you suggest we bridge it?
What a question. I think there are multiple factors. I know that there are multiple factors, as with many answers. One, the majority of the VC industry remains male. So I can't remember the stats exactly, but it's a really high percentage. And so it's hard for them to understand women's problems or women's health issues because they haven't necessarily experienced them or felt how frustrating it is. And linked to this, the taboo nature of so many women's health topics, whether that be fertility or the menstrual cycle or menopause, means that we don't discuss it in society. Even women don't discuss it between themselves sometimes. It depends who, obviously, but women don't discuss it with themselves, let alone women and men. That's hard. Another element is that there lacks data in women's health and research. There is a serious underfunding of research and data in the space. And that means that I believe the women's health market is much bigger than we think it is, just because we haven't researched these areas. So an example that I was reading the other day is that between 2019 and 2023, there was 6 times more funding in erectile dysfunction than endometriosis. Now, endometriosis affects 10% of women. It's a huge issue that we still don't have a solution for. And so that just shows you that there is a mismatch. And I think it's also just because people don't know about it, people don't talk about it, and that comes from a fundamental lack of research as well. So I think those are the key issues. I think obviously there are other things, such as most Femtech companies are female founded, and there's like those biases that we have to deal with, etc., etc. But it's a serious issue. And the stat that blew my mind as well is that only 3% of digital health funding went to Femtech in recent years, which is it's very minimal considering that it's half the population. So it means that there are loads of opportunities as well. I'm really excited for people to wake up and for the space to start moving. And I think when it starts moving, it's going to be exponential, because as people realize how important this is, it will grow and grow faster than we can imagine. At least that is my hope.
I'm curious, would you say that the issue of underfunding and the lack of research are perhaps connected, or that there is some sort of correlation between the two?
Yeah, I really think there is. So firstly, if we're to talk, so I was talking about funding in terms of VC funding, but if we're to talk women's health funding and general health funding, the majority of health research funding comes from states and governments and public funding. And there are statistics showing that women's health is underfunded within those scenarios as well. So it means that if the health funding that is generally meant to be fairly distributed and tends to launch more research is already unbalanced, then it leads to unbalanced research, and then further down the line it leads to unbalanced VC funding and startups growth.
So a bit of a vicious cycle there.
Exactly.
Okay. I'm just trying to bring your expertise in copywriting back into, or at least related to, this particular space. Businesses obviously need to create a brand voice and messaging strategy, regardless of the particular product. But in the Femtech space, what does that look like in order to resonate with their intended audience?
It's a great question, because it's actually quite a tricky one, because the audience is not the only thing you have to think about when you're thinking about Fem. You're thinking about medical accuracy, and you're also thinking about the algorithms, because algorithms tend to be biased against women's health or anything sexually related. And so those are two obstacles that you already have to think about before or at the same time as you're thinking about your audience. And then in terms of audience, I've seen different Femtech companies approach it in different ways. And granted, their audience is different. The first thing I'll say is that the audience is changing. People are becoming more aware that our menstrual cycle has 4 phases, or that we have more contraceptive options, etc. And so there is more of a shift towards more empowering language, more empowering visuals, versus if we're going way back, if you think about ads for tampons, etc., they used to be very much women in white and talking about being invisible and not showing that you have your period. And now, finally, in more places, it's legal to use real blood for photos on ads, etc. But that also comes along with more empowering language, and women want that. So that's been a very interesting shift. The second thing is that it depends on the audience. And I think for the messaging, what is difficult in Femtech is that often your clientele might not have a great understanding on the problem you are trying to solve, or on general women's health. Because, for example, if we take fertility, no, actually, let's take menopause. Menopause is easier for this example. If you are providing hormone replacement therapy or something similar, so basically an aid to reduce menopause symptoms, a lot of women who have menopause, one, aren't realizing that they have menopause, aren't understanding the symptoms, and 3, aren't talking about it. And so it's a really interesting space in terms of messaging, because you're catering to different audiences. One that might not understand what menopause is and what perimenopause is and all the symptoms associated to it, and then one that is specifically looking to deal with these symptoms. And so with the messaging, you're having to balance the two. And I think what tends to happen is that femtech companies either go quite specialized and very medically focused, or they go very big statements, empowering language, feminist power, that kind of messaging. It's not yet a developed space. It's not that developed. Right. And so I think there'll be much more different types of messaging in the future. For now, we've seen them, in my opinion, the copywriting can be similar in a lot of femtech companies, which makes sense because what works, right?
Okay. So with your particular project where you're making information available around the whole menstrual cycle, I'm curious, obviously creating information is one thing, but perhaps a bigger issue is actual distribution and ensuring that it gets into the hands of those who actually need it and use it, to use it. How are you addressing that particular issue?
Yeah, it's a really big issue on my mind. So at the moment, our business model is B2C. So we provide it for customers. What we have said throughout is if someone can't afford it, we will give it to them free. So we have given at least 10 to 20 guides out for free of people who have emailed us saying, listen, I'm really sorry, I can't do it. I can't afford it. So that is good. But it's not enough, right? Because these people are already aware of the gap in their knowledge and are specifically emailing us for it. The other thing we're doing is I work very closely with period poverty organizations in Morocco. And in the future, we hope to collaborate with some in the UK. We already give 10% of all profits to Bloody Good Period, which is period poverty in the UK. And what we do is for these NGOs, we've also provided in Mexico. We've also been speaking to one in Mexico. Anyways, I'm diverging. But for all period poverty NGOs, we provide this for free. So they are able to distribute it with the products that they are providing to local women together. That means that they already have the education aspect covered. because often period poverty organizations run awareness campaigns with the period product. They do that together. Now, awareness campaigns, in reality, you don't have much time on the ground. You're driving. If I take as an example the Moroccan period poverty organization Nouvelle Air that I work for, we take 4 hours to get somewhere because it's a very remote location that is in need. And then you really only have 2 hours on the ground. You can't cover everything in that time. And ideally, what we want to do is that these period poverty organizations focus on the period product and how we use it and how we make sure that it's hygienic. And then they can give access to the website, which actually these local communities do have access to through their phone. The one thing is language, which we're thinking about. And yeah, it's in our mind. But ultimately, our purpose is, of course, to get it in the hands of people who need it. I think it's going to take a bit of time and development to figure that out.
Certainly, quite the challenge there. Just to help us understand the impact of your work, could you share perhaps specific examples how the lack of education in women's health, including menstrual cycle, has actually affected individuals or even communities on a larger scale?
Yes, one example, which I was interviewing for our podcast recently, because we're really pushing more women to share their experience, because that is an issue, is someone who only found out she had endometriosis after suffering 6 years from horrible period pain. And this is very common because globally it takes 7 years to diagnose endometriosis. Now, for those who don't know what endometriosis is, a condition that 10% of women have, so that's 190 million people on this planet, when you, at a very basic level, it's when you menstruate, you don't just bleed from your vagina, but also somewhere else in your body. And it can be extremely painful. And this condition globally takes on average 7 years to be diagnosed, which is so long if you imagine how long a woman can be in pain every single month for 4 days. And so, but the issue is so many people just don't know what it is. They don't know that that endometriosis exists and they might have it, which means that if they've never really heard about periods and they haven't really studied it or haven't really discussed it with people, they might just think that this pain is normal and that all women have it because they've never known any different. And it depends for who, but it's very often debilitating and has a huge impact on life. So that's one example where education on what is the norm, what is the norm, and when you should go and see a doctor is really important. Another element, which is it's less extreme, let's say, or it's not a condition, is when our menstrual cycle has 4 phases. And so we have different hormones in each phase. And often our latter phase, so luteal, and then our menstrual, our hormones are at levels which often make you more depressed, more sensitive, more sad. These can be like, if you know that it's this phase, you can do things to make it better. And that is really great. You can work with your cycle, which means that you're able to just live a happier life. Now, it's not all bad. I'm saying luteal, but you also have the ovulatory phase, which when we compare it to seasons, we call it your summer, when you feel confident and you feel great and your sexual drive is higher, etc., etc. And so during that period, ask for a raise, for example. And so knowing your different phases can help you understand your own body and understand your feelings and not necessarily always associate it to the outside world and understand that, oh, this actually might just be my hormones at this phase. Let's not stress about it and let's do this and this to make it better. Yeah, those are two examples.
So thank you for that. So obviously this is a very complex area, and earlier you mentioned that some topics related to sexual health are censored on social media platforms. So for businesses operating in the Femtech industry, there's obviously challenges. I'm curious, how do you navigate the censorship on these platforms in order to actively get the information out there to those who need it?
So I'm going to talk about understand your cycle because the rest is client information. But the main way, honestly, is testing what works and what doesn't work, because all of the algorithms are slightly different. And so, for example, on LinkedIn, one piece of content might not work so well, but on Instagram, it will work quite well. Changing the format, etc., to suit Instagram, it will be different due to the different algorithms. The other way so that's testing. The other way we go about it is using our personal brands to push it, because Tara, my co-founder, is an influencer on Instagram and I have a LinkedIn following. And so by posting about other things as well as this, we can use the personal brand to push women's health as well. The other one, which we're working a lot on at the moment, is collaborations with relevant partners. That's important to, just cement the followership, because they tend to be people who already follow a menstrual cycle or period related page. And so collaborating with them helps boost our brand and their brand at the same time. So those are the main three. I'm sure we'll think of more in the future, but those are what we've been working on. There's also, what's lovely about the Femtech industry is that the community is quite tight because it's a small industry still. I think I know I don't want to say the majority, but I know quite a lot of content and copywriters in the space, because there just aren't that many. And that means that my LinkedIn feed is primarily populated by tips, advice, and like reflections on one campaign or another campaign. And so through this sharing, we're also able to learn what has worked less. In the future, I hope we don't have to do this and that algorithms promote women's health rather than putting it down. But that is a hope that I can't control.
Certainly. Okay. What about success stories, all positive outcomes resulting from the efforts to educate women, be it around women's health in general or menstrual cycles?
Yeah, I think there are a host of success stories, because I actually think even if just one woman is empowered and feels like she knows her menstrual cycle, that is already a success. I grew up between Morocco and London, and so Morocco has a very dear place in my heart, which is why my period poverty work is focused on Morocco. So I'll take a story from Morocco. Our period poverty campaigns have made the national news, have also helped hundreds of women in the poorest places of Morocco. And that has led us to get more sponsorship and more funding from organizations, which hopefully in the future will lead to even more impact. So that is more on the period poverty front. But with that, we have led so many awareness campaigns. And so when you go with a doctor to these very remote places that don't see a doctor very often, and she comes into a room of 30 or 40 women and they're asking so many different questions, that to me is a success story. And what is great is that often you start speaking about the menstrual cycle, but you end up also speaking about sexual health. And both are very important, and both are not spoken about enough, particularly in these regions. And it's very hard to describe the energy in the room, and how at the start everyone's a little shy, and then by the end people are talking about periods as if it's, what food are we bringing to lunch tomorrow? So for me, that's a big success story.
I'm curious, would you say that, or perhaps you've encountered situations where businesses have struggled to gather or present compelling customer stories? If so, what advice would you give to these companies to overcome such challenges, especially in a sensitive space like Femtech?
Yeah, I think it's a really big challenge, because a lot of, if I take the example of fertility, people who go through IVF or egg freezing, very often it's quite traumatic experience that they don't want to share. And so it is hard to get reviews, feedback, shared experiences, etc. My advice, actually, from my experience, and it's relevant to some companies and or not, for international companies, Americans tend to be more willing to share than the UK or France. That's from my experience, particularly those from San Francisco, LA. They're much more open about this space and they want to share. Thinking about the geography, and then the other tip is just having the ability to be anonymous, because I think ultimately the goal of more women sharing their experiences, so that the women that go into this process or have these experiences in the future are able to prepare themselves better. That is a great goal that probably most women would want to participate in. But I think reducing how sensitive it is by taking away the name, the photo, all of that is helpful. Now, often that's less good for the marketing, because people relate to people. And so when there's a name and when there's a photo, people are like, yes, yay. I think for now, that is what we need to be doing. And I really believe that more women sharing their experiences will just help more women understand the space, understand what they're going into. Because currently, if you look up egg freezing on Google, you get a very scientific analysis of what will happen. But like, how will you feel? What does the needle look like? All of these things that you want to know is actually really hard to find. So having more sharing of these experiences would be really helpful, but it's tricky on all.
These customer stories or good perspectives, something that you actively incorporate into your copy or content, just out of curiosity?
Yes, so I advise clients on their websites as well, and that is much more than copy. So I do the whole website layout, etc. And in that, I incorporate reviews and try to emphasize where they are. For Understand Your Cycle, we're actually building a platform specifically to share experiences, and the podcast that we will start releasing soon, hopefully, is all about women sharing their experiences. And I know that many femtech companies are trying, but it is, as you mentioned, it's tough. I've asked so many people to be on the podcast and they kindly refused, because they still feel too emotional about whatever it is I'm asking them to talk about.
As you look to the future of femtech and women's health education, what do you believe would be potential outcomes, at least in the short term, if some of these gaps could be bridged?
So in a dream world where all the gaps are bridged, what happens?
Well, I think some of them, if not all of them.
In my big dreamy world, women live happier, healthier lives. Essentially, if we really break it down, that is it. But for me, it's women's health is such a key part of women's empowerment, Because if you don't feel good in your body, how, or in yourself or in your health, how can you go out and, I don't want to say fight inequality because that sounds aggressive, but go be your best self? And if we're not our best selves, then the biases of the past will remain. So for me, women's health is so incredibly key within the whole female empowerment movement. And so I think that is a key element. Another one is reducing period poverty. Right now, I think, I don't want to say the wrong stat, but I'll check it just after, but something like 8 out of 10 girls in Africa miss school because of their period. So wow. Think about the education gap that leads to. That's crazy. And of course, that then leads to gender inequality, leads to poverty, leads to all the rest of the things. So that is another element. And the final one I want to mention, because I could go on forever on this. Actually, I'll mention two more. One is on period products. Period products currently are full of plastics and carcinogens, like the usual tampons and pads that people buy in the supermarket. If they're not organic, are often full of plastic. And so within a period of 4 days, you could be using the equivalent of 80 plastic bags. So this, for climate change purposes and for the whole green movement, is also very important. And so once the funding is there, once the education is there, hopefully we can make a more solid move to sustainable period products that don't cost the planet whilst still being comfortable and good for women's health, because putting plastic in your body is not good. And the last one I will mention, even though I could mention many more, is progress on the front of contraception. So many women struggle with this, and it is unfortunately very much still a women's issue. Yes, the partner or men are involved, but the person that has to take on the burden of going to the doctor, figuring out which contraception to take, figuring out when to take it, and the person that gets all the side effects tends to be the woman. And for many of the contraceptives that we use today, there hasn't been research or a development in the products for ages. And I've met so many women who have tried X amount of contraceptives and each one gives them a horrible side effect. And I just think that should not be the case. So hopefully there will be more research and development in that field as well. And also education, because many women were given the pill or given a certain contraceptive when they were 16 and without the information behind it, without the options of the others, and have taken it ever since without even thinking, oh, like this could be doing this to my body, maybe I would be happier with this. And so I believe that more funding, education, research in that area will be really beneficial as well. There are many more, but those are some that I've been thinking about a lot lately.
Brilliant, thank you for that. In the Femtech space, especially amongst the companies that operate in that space, would you say that there are a couple of aspects that doesn't get much airtime in their conversations, or PR, if I could use a broad term like that? If so, what would they be?
For sure, and it really depends on the country. So and it's really interesting because startups come from, like, when it's a space that has more PR, they tend to get more funding and tend to be more successful and then progress. So I would say menopause has been quite popular, not popular, but quite spoken about in the UK, for example. And the subject of endometriosis has been spoken about more, still not enough, in France. I'm less familiar with the US, and I feel like the US market is actually quite multifaceted. So those are the ones that have been given airtime. All the others really haven't. And I was speaking to someone recently about breastfeeding and early motherhood that I think isn't, at least in my surrounding areas, doesn't get much airtime. Menstrual cycle related issues such as, I think endometriosis is starting to get more airtime, but still, given the amount of people it affects, the ratio is not balanced yet. But there are also other menstrual cycle related issues such as PMDD, PCOS, etc., that don't get much airtime. I think those are the key ones because fertility is starting to become more spoken about. There are many different areas of fertility, and menopause also is starting to become more spoken about, along with period products and the different options that you have, and contraception actually with that as well. But what I will say is it really depends on the region. It depends also on the government. So the one menopause in the UK getting airtime is thanks to the parliament. It's also thanks to people like Davina McCall that are very famous talking about it. And so that's quite specific to the UK. In France, no one speaks about menopause still. Obviously not no one, but very few people.
Sure.
And then in France, Macron mentioning endometriosis suddenly put that on the agenda. So I think there's also very much a governmental aspect to all of this, particularly in countries where the government has a heavy influence on the health system.
To wrap things up, Capcucine, if you were listening to this episode, what would you say would be your biggest takeaway?
Oh, that's such a good question. It depends who I am, but if Femtech was new to you before listening to this episode,
yep.
I would say the biggest takeaway is the exponential opportunity that is in the Femtech space and the inequality that currently exists in health funding, research, distribution are the two main takeaways, because so many people I know have never heard of that until I tell them. And those will be the two I pick.
Sure. And for those who are curious, want to know more or connect with you, where would you recommend they head to?
I recommend LinkedIn. I'm very active on LinkedIn. And just LinkedIn. I think from LinkedIn, you can find me everywhere.
Okay. No worries. We'll include a link to that in the show notes. Capcucine, thank you so much for doing this. It's been very insightful.
Thank you so much, Vinay. It's been an absolute pleasure. And thank you for all your amazing questions.